Welcome, welcome to the second day of Institutions. I'm so happy to see you all, so many people. Yesterday we also had full house. It was a very, very nice day, but a long day. And it's super hot, so we will take it slow for today. So another full program, another beautiful program organized by Bruno and the team. I bid you a big applause for Bruno and for the team for all the work that they've done. And And also a big applause for all the participants and speakers of yesterday and of today. And yeah. So Bruno will lay out the day. I hope you'll stay with us for the rest of the day. If you have questions, I'm here. Bruno's here. And good luck. Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Well, thank you for joining us on such a hot day. We only have like 2 hours in this auditorium to go, so it should be fine. Thank you for those who joined us yesterday and came back today. I'm also aware that some of you might not have been here yesterday. So apologies for those who have heard this before, but I will just give a very brief introduction of what like this overarching symposium is about and what happened in the first day. So over these 2 days, this is the second and last day of the symposium. We're gathering different practices that show us some of the ways in which artistic practice can engage with political, economic, and institutional conditions that surround them. Not as sites of constraints, but as sites of possibility, sites of action. And maybe through this entanglement between artistic and institutional practice, that they can prefigure new forms of social political organization or other blueprints for art institutions or even other forms of expanded agency of artistic practice. So throughout yesterday and today, there's like a big lexicon and different examples of how that can unfold in different contexts. So before I introduce the speakers for today and the session today, I wanted to give you an overview of what happened yesterday. Apologizing again for those who have been here yesterday. I've heard it all. But let me start. I have 2 little hands for all the buttons I need to push. So yesterday we began by asking how artistic and institutional practices can generate ecologically grounded forms of action within wider social ecological systems. So Maastricht-based farmer and researcher Reinier Hoen opened the day presenting his ongoing PhD research exploring how the intersections between cabbage breeding and artistic practice can propose alternatives to the concentration of power in the seed industry, as well as catalyze a new culture of relation with food and with the ecosystems that sustain it. Then cooking sections took us across different landscapes and infrastructures, from the wetlands of north of Istanbul, where water buffalo, food traditions, and farming practices become ways of imagining other futures under environmental and real estate pressures of that locality. Then we traveled to Folkestone, where the Ministry of Sewers gives public and legal voice to grievances around coastal pollution. And finally to Sicily and Puglia, where they established a long-term agreement between agroecological farmers, cooperatives, and the Museo delle Civiltà, and formalized an annual seed exchange that keeps seeds free of ownership, patents, and commercial restrictions. And then Delia Hanna brought together these 2 practices into conversation, opening up kind of a reflection on the links between the homogenization of taste and the homogenization of desire and imagination. Then the day moved into a performative dinner by Nathalie Mouchamad, who took the breadfruit as a living entity through which to connect colonial histories, plantation economies, and contemporary struggles for food sovereignty. We also had 3 workshops, and we divided the audience into these 3 different worlds. So Vijay Maya Pachinelam led a collective discussions around the ad hoc kitchen he ran during his residency at the Jan van Eyck in 2013, reflecting how artistic practice can test and expand the plasticity of institutional frameworks, among many other things. And then Natasha Hagenbeck and Rory took us through the Van Eyck building in a role-play exercise before turning to the garden and its soil practices to rethink institutions from within. And then Katrin Bohm, in collaboration with the Printing and Publishing Lab, devised a workshop that translated lived and diverse everyday economic knowledge into posters, flyers, and other printed materials that you can still see there and outside. And please take them away and distribute them as much as possible. And these materials were then, so the materials were then integrated into her keynote, where she reflected on artistic practice as economic practice and on the possibility of collectively enacting more than capitalist futures. So her call to take back the economy, which was the title of the keynote, was a proposition to recognize artistic practice as economic practice, capable of scaling up by scaling out. So this leads us to today. Hisham already thanked the team and all the participants and contributors for this event, but really, I think it's important to reiterate, it's the type of communal effort that crosses all the organization in its many different layers, from kitchen to finances, from participants, helping each other, to external guests and contributors. So I'd like to reiterate that before we move on, and all that you see, taste, listen, and experience throughout the day is the fruit of that. But today we'll start with 2 consecutive lectures, one by Gareth Bell-Jones and the second by Chiara De Cesari, followed by a roundtable. So muster yourselves for some time here, engaging time, and please bring back some questions and comments for the roundtable and Q&A session. And then we'll split up in the workshops, and I'll explain the practicalities of that later on. And the program will continue from there on. So the first lecture is titled Individual and Organization, Artist Placement Group, and Flat Time House, and is a lecture by Gareth Bell-Jones, who is a curator based in London and the director of Flat Time House. So from 2010 to 14, he was a curator at the Wising Art Center and tutor in curating contemporary art at the RCA, the Royal College of Art. Gareth also founded the London Residency Network in 2022 and co-founded the Artist Placement Group successor organization called the Incidental Unit in 2016. But I guess you tell us all about it. So, floor is yours, Gareth. Thank you very much.
It's a real genuine pleasure to be here at the Van Eyck. I'm so grateful to be speaking at this conference. Yesterday was an absolutely incredible day, and the programming by Bruno has been absolutely wonderful, so I'm really grateful for you to invite me to be here. So I'm going to be speaking about 2 organizations. They are interrelated. They're both founded by a separate artist, but they were also professional and personal partners. Both these organizations present institutional structures as artworks, and each of them was shaped by the artists that created them. So I'm going to introduce Artist Placement Group first, with a focus on John Latham's Scottish office placements, and then I'll move on to how this placement informed the creation of Flat Time House and how that operates within the structures set by Latham's thinking. So when talking about Artist Placement Group, or APG, as it's called, as it's known, first of all, I wanted to give a caveat that there were many, many people involved in APG, and all of them will have different accounts of the history of Artist Placement Group. And so my account can't help but be coloured by having worked with Barbara Stavini and also living in John Latham's house. But there are some things which are just facts. APG devised and created a structure for placements for artists, first in industry and later in government departments. It was instigated by Barbara Stavini with Joan Hills of the Boyle family in 1965, and founded a year later with John Latham, Anna Ridley, Barry Flanagan, David Hall, and Geoffrey Shaw. It went on to have a constantly shifting coterie of artists that all swirled around John and Barbara. Key to the emergence of APG in the mid-60s was this kind of cross-pollination of the avant-garde and popular culture, a movement towards dematerialization in art practice and in industry, and a move from Fordist to a post-Fordist economy. So Barbara Stavini was born in Mashhad in Iran, which sort of suggests a kind of the imperial legacy that she's part of and the privilege that she came from. She's the daughter of a British spy, a Colonel Leo Stavini, and Mashhad on the border of Afghanistan was really the center of the Great Game at this period. So Barbara grew up between India and southern England in Devon. In Devon, she danced at Dartington Hall with the Ballet Russe, and she always wanted to be a dancer. However, her parents persuaded her to go to secretarial college, something which she called a disaster zone. So she persuaded them that art was a realistic kind of career, and she signed up to Chelsea College, where she had Henry Moore as a tutor, and she met her future partner, John Latham. So Barbara spent many years as a housewife, raising kids with John, but also making her own artwork in a less kind of much more difficult position than it was for John Latham, who could just concentrate on the work. But whilst gathering materials for the artists who stayed with them in Portland Road, people like Daniel Sparee and Robert Filiu and Fluxus artists, and when assemblage was really fashionable at the time, Barbara had a revelation while collecting these materials. You know, why aren't industries inviting us in? We should be talking to the head of the industry rather than kind of scrabbling around trying to find materials. And she said, why aren't we artists in the factories? So from 1966 to 82, Barbara was APG's spokesperson, and she negotiated the placements with corporations. She was the primary face of the organization. This, despite at times being described with gender-inflected terms such as company secretary or even Mrs. John Latham. This is a piece to camera from Barbara from 1972 for an event at the ICA.
And tell you a bit about the Artist Placement Group, which is basically in our book. APG was formed in 1966, and we say here to examine the potential activity of artists relative to industrial and commercial organizations, and to investigate the circumstances of their segregation and look into ways in which the two could be brought closer together. Since then, we have very much learnt a lot about negotiating with industry and with organizations of all kinds. It's now very much organizations and the individual. And the long-term objective of APG are to make it common practice for organizations of all kinds to adopt the principle of having artists associated on an open brief. In calling for placement of an artist within an organization for a significant period of time, and while working in association with the organization, he has a status of an autonomous professional whose work has a fundamental role in the social, economic, and conceptual structure of the community in which he is part. We hope that the artist will go into the organization to carry out a far-reaching dialogue with that organization's staff and research into its resources, and in the end to realize works which will demonstrate a really strong level of art organization into reaction, which might not have been possible with preconceived ideas of what one might do from the outside. The principal activities of the group are the placement of individuals in association with all sorts of organizations, as I said, industries, schools, universities, banks and hospitals, government departments, town planning authorities, in fact, any service organizations.
So APG's approach became a key component of British conceptual art, revolutionizing the idea of the artist studio as a space for thinking and transferring it into the factory and then into government and policy making. Each placement was designed for a specific artist in context, paid at management rate, and with each artist given an own office by the host. The placements lasted between a few months and a few years, and they began with a feasibility study followed by the placement. Initially, APG received funding from the Arts Council of Great Britain and from a cut from the artist fees. Three key aspects were the notion of the open brief, So that's the artist would not work to solve a set problem and would be paid regardless of the outcome. The second was the concept of the incidental person, which is a term that they used instead of artist. I'll go on to describe that a bit. And the third and the key axiom was context is half the work, which suggests that the role they believed art should play in society and how art should exist within the world. This is an early manifesto from '68, where they state that it is very important that goings-on are taken as the basis for art. It's important that artists use non-art contexts. It's important that artists challenge current priority systems, that artists call themselves anything but artists, that artists question initial assumptions, that they are given professional status, they are put in positions close to decision makers, they recognize what verbal information has done, and they recognize what verbal information hasn't done. So the first placements, like this one at BXL Polymer Group, they focused on industry. And in this way, it's kind of similar to experiments in art and technology, which started in New York also in the same year, in '66. The idea being that artists would have access to materials and processes which they otherwise wouldn't, and the company would have their experimentation and benefit from new uses of these materials. It quickly went on to move into a different direction, however. A quick sense of like the administrative work that Barbara undertook, and this is only a tiny fragment of the number of corporations that she was in contact with. And with all of this correspondence over decades, there were only ever 10 full placements and around 20 in varying stages of completion and informality. Thousands more have been contacted. So some examples of these early placements are here with very sort of 60s-looking artwork there. Geoffrey Shaw and the Event Structure Research Group, Waterwork from 1969. And I think these inflatable sculptures demonstrate the original aims of APG. Next to that, you have David Hall's Scottish television interruptions, which interrupted TV breaks. Stuart Brisley's Polywheel, in which his work was looking at the poor communication between management and the shop floor. And he made this polywheel, this structure made out of chairs from the furniture company, as a symbol for the closed circuit, the lack of communication within the group. The company then went to use it as their company logo, so maybe they missed the point. Gareth Evans' placement, and this is an image from his show at the Hayward Gallery, started to hint at the future direction that APG would take. In this work, you see a series of steel constructions made by the apprentice welders, which he understood as ready-made sculpture. He began to observe the social dynamics and the organizational structures between the factory workers and management levels, and drafted a series of reports advising like changes that the corporation could make. So this show I mentioned, the Hayward Gallery show, this took part in 1971 alongside another important exhibition from the same year, which was Between Six at Kunsthalle Dusseldorf, and then later in the year, this show, Inno, Art and Economics, in December. The whole gallery was given to the Artist Placement Group by the Arts Council, and it brought together work from all the early placements. The intention of the show was to question the role of economics in society and where we place value. I've heard it is one of the least well-attended exhibitions in the history of the Hayward Gallery, but as we understand it, the audience was never intended to be the general public. They were trying to draw in the titans of industry, policymakers, politicians, and people of influence. And the forum for that can be seen in this image here. So this is from Dusseldorf. You can tell by the chairs. They've got much nicer chairs in Germany. I did some research on that. This is the work. I know exactly what they are. This is the sculpture. So this is the sculpture in its active state. So when people are gathering and in conversation, bringing together of artists and industrialists. And the meetings were streamed on German TV and live elsewhere in the gallery in London. Here again is the sculpture in its inactive space. So they turned the whole of these gallery spaces, the Kunsthalles, into boardrooms, essentially, for conversation. And as you can see in this image, there is an attempt to lean into this boardroom aesthetic. And this is consistent throughout in this period, using corporate design aesthetics. If you read the documents, you can see that it's deliberately satirical, and yet I think it can also be read as an attempt to speak in terms that could be understood by the host party and potential partners. So the main proposal, or the thrust of the Hayward Gallery show, Art and Economics, was this document here on the left called Offer for Sale. And this was a radical proposal, mainly drafted by John Latham, which was suggesting that it is a recalculation of how we consider value. John was proposing that we move from calculating value in terms of pound sterling and object value to shift to attention, which seems very prescient nowadays, I think. We actually have, like, in standard John Latham archival material fashion, the calculations determine how you calculate value. And there was a unit that he created called a delta unit. And this was a kind of scale going from 0, which would be sleep, to 100, which, I don't know, might be enlightenment or something like this. These ideas weren't taken on board. However, we know that in the run-up to the Hayward Gallery show, the head of the Arts Council of Great Britain was attending every single meeting by the Artist Placement Group, which seems absolutely crazy, because at the moment that's Nicholas Sirota. It's if he was attending your artist meetings every week. And that, I think, hints at the value that the Arts Council were putting on this research being undertaken by this group of artists, that there was potentially something interesting in terms of how we can reconsider the role of art in society. So, moving on from Delta, the Hayward show really had a massive falling out within Arts Placement Group afterwards. It left many members absolutely exhausted, and there was a split with some people leaving, noticeably Stuart Brisley and Gustav Metzger. This critique by Stuart Brisley essentially is saying, it's called No, It Is Not On. He gets close to calling John Latham a tyrant. He essentially says the Artist Placement Group is acquiescing to capitalist structures, and this is clear in the text. He suggests that APG is one of a series of artists' organizations founded in the 60s. They now appear to have been a series of attempts to resolve aspects of the developing larger crisis in which artists and art are seen to be largely irrelevant given the priorities of capitalist society. So if we go back to the Delta unit, you can see that John Latham has designed this logo, this triangle, and what that was intended to demonstrate that APG was outside of a political persuasion, that they weren't on a spectrum of left and right, but were apart from that. The Delta unit also is, in chemistry, is used to symbolize or represent a change in energy. So this kind of shift in change, and it's tilted, so it doesn't suggest a hierarchical structure, but is one that's in balance and at potential of changing. So a low APG regarded themselves being outside of politics. Those even within APG didn't necessarily believe that themselves. So continuing the fallout from the Hayward Gallery show, the Arts Council decided to remove all funding from the Artist Placement Group on the basis that APG is more concerned with social engineering than with straight art. What the Arts Council then did was give the officers to a new program called the Artist Placement Program, I think it was called, and they began a new model called the Artist in Residence. And in 1972, funded by the Gulbenkian Foundation, this new artist residency program became the basis for the structures of artist residencies as they exist in the UK today. Now, John wasn't John wasn't happy about this, and he spent many years trying to sue the Arts Council. It kind of led to this event in many kind of problems he had with the government, where he shot maritime flares over the top of the Houses of Parliament. It's something that you probably couldn't get away with today. However, also in 1972, through the conversations that they'd been able to negotiate at the Hayward and elsewhere, they actually began serious conversations with the British government and with the civil service. And under the Conservative leader, Ted Heath, they negotiated what they called a Whitehall Memorandum. So this documented the support for artist placements within government institutions, and it was agreed that there was a bilateral interest between artist activity and government activity, which later led to a number of APG placements. With Labour in power in '74, and you can see there Barbara Castle and Tony Benn, like some really serious figures in the Labour left, they were strong advocates for APG and really pushed to help some of these placements take place. Some examples here are George Levantis in Ocean Fleets, and you have to say that some of these placements were much more successful than others. So George's artwork was eventually thrown overboard. He was on a ship with the Merchant Navy, and the captain said, if we'd wanted some sort of sociologist on board, we would have hired one. David Toop did a placement with the Department of Health and Social Services, and he was working with dementia sufferers. He created something with others, Hugh Davis and other artists, called Reminiscence Aids. And this was to kind of sound for dementia sufferers to help them kind of move to the past and ease their suffering. In the bottom left is an image from Roger Coward's placement, the Department of the Environment. And this was looking at inner city deprivation and community outreach. And in the bottom right, Ian Breakwell's placement with Rampton and Broadmoor high security psychiatric hospitals. So the evaluation report of that particular placement is still held under the Official Secrets Act. However, Ian made a film from that called The Institution, and that directly inspired, with leaked footage, a 1979 ITV expose called Secret Hospital, which led to a major independent review of the prison service and prison reform. So by the end of the 70s, APG started to look outside of the United Kingdom. Joseph Boyce invited them to speak at Documenta in 1977, and they were part of this event that he was also part of called Kunsthal Social Strategy in Bonn. And it was through this process of working in Germany that they began to develop something they called the incidental person approach to government. And this was effectively a new manifesto where APG was shifting from focusing on leading on their own placements, but rather advocating for the placement model internationally. So here you can see some images of working around Europe, in France, Austria, the Netherlands, and Germany, and they went on to work with UNESCO. There was only one kind of half-finished placement that came out of this, with John working in Rhine-Ruhr region. It did have a brief, but the brief was only why do accidents happen? It was within the transport department. So the later years of APG, it kind of dwindled out towards 1989, and it renamed itself as Organisation and Information. This new or reboot of APG had a focus on education, and the major project that they did was the Southwark Education Research Project. This placed artists in schools, and they were working with the Greater London Council to propose changes to the new UK educational curriculum. So APG finally was wound up in 2008, but then it restarted again as the incidental unit in 2016, and this is a group that continued to meet monthly. So that was the long history of Artist Placement Group, and now I'm going to move on to John Latham, and we're going to look at one of his placements with Artist Placement Group and how that's informed the structure of the organisation that I work within. How are people doing? It's quite hot, right? You okay? So John Latham was born in 1921 in Livingstone in Zambia. As a 19-year-old boy, he fought in the First World War. He saw ships sunk around him, people killed. He had a revelation while in Rome, seeing these El Greco paintings, that he wanted to become an artist. He enrolled in Chelsea College, met Barbara Stavini, and his early paintings are kind of pseudo-surrealist, very flat paintings. However, he came in contact with two scientists, Clive Gregory and Anita Kozin, and he began working with them. In 1954, they asked him to make a mural for their Halloween party. And instead of painting in his normal style, he decided to pick up a spray gun. And so for him, this allowed him to immerse himself into the discussions that he'd been having with Gregory and Kozin. They developed something that they called O structure, which was an attempt to suggest that matter is part of time, that time encompasses matter. And I won't get into the theoretical physics of that because partly I can't. But for John, this meant that finally the making of the work was also the idea. So with these works, he continued to work with spray for the rest of his life. And really with these works, you can kind of almost like read John's work, almost like a hieroglyphic system. Depending on the material or the media, you can kind of get to grips with what he's trying to say. With these spray works, he's communicating that everything is time-based, everything is an event, everything is constantly in flux. And he made many canvases in many different forms. Some of the canvases were activated canvases where you could only see the back of them and would roll up and down, such as this one here in the Tate. Some were more explicitly intended as kind of teaching aids, where he would be explaining his ideas. What he first called time-based indetermination in events developed into something he called event structure, and it was only at the very end of his life that he came up with this concept that he called flat time. This is the time-based role that we have, flat time house. So another key tenet in John's work is, so everything is an event, but also to distrust authorities of knowledge. And the way that he kind of symbolizes this in his work is through the book medium. So he uses the book as a symbol of received opinion, but then refuses you to access it in a rational manner. You can't read it as you would normally. One of the works that he's famous for is this piece, Art and Culture Still in Chew, where with Barry Flanagan, he got students from St. Martin's. They took out Clement Greenberg's Art and Culture. As a big party, they all ate it, spat it out. John distilled the remaining pulp and spit and created a pure spirit of art and culture, which he returned to the library, and then his contract wasn't renewed. That work is now in the, shown by Lucy Lippard, and is now in the Museum of Modern Art collection in New York. The bookworks also represent a shift in time as well, and constant flux. And you can see this work, Film Star, that's in the Tate collection. The color of the work changes depending on the estate will choose the color of the piece every time it's displayed. And with other pieces, you can see this kind of experimentation with these cluster pieces, Little Red Mountain that's in the Pompidou collection, experimentation with materials like polyurethane foam. These are a couple images from the Destruction Art Symposium of '66. You can see Gustav Metzger on the right. These he called Scoob Tower ceremonies. Scoob's books backwards. And he would get Encyclopedia Britannica, stack them up, and set them on fire. The intention was not to suggest a rejection of knowledge, but that we should question knowledge. So if you think of this in the context of the trauma of the Second World War, it's a kind of questioning of everything that's got us to that point. These are performances, theatre performances, work with glass. This is a vacuum within a glass sphere within a vacuum within a glass sphere. Piranha Tank worked for TV, film work, concrete poetry, and performance poetry. And John pretty much worked with every medium that was used in the 20th century. This piece, which is a kind of collision of art and science, where he's proposing an incidental person comprehension. So not everybody in APG was on board with John's methodologies or his time-based ideas. But John believed that APG could be used to question the structures of power, and rather than destroying them, work out how best to use them. APG could be used as a means to infiltrate bureaucratic structures and introduce what he called reflective, intuitive, long-term thinking. A key idea for John was this concept of the incidental person. And this was that this could be anyone operating as a time-based. It wasn't solely the domain of artists. So, although this is something that artists are quite good, time-based thinking, durational thinking, and thinking in context, what John wanted to do was make this mode of thinking available to everybody. So not all artists would necessarily be incidental person, but you could be a plumber or a lawyer and be an incidental person. I think a really brilliant example was yesterday with Rainier Hoon, who I really enjoyed his talk. And when he was talking about cabbage breeding and specialization, he was talking about the scope of 8,000 years. And this was like very sort of incidental person practice, John would have thought, I think. That quote that he said for Kitty de Jager, you did what we would never do, but probably should have done, I think summarizes the intention for Artist Placement Group and the incidental person role. This image we're looking at here is from the Clare Hall Hospital. And this was John's first placement. He nearly killed himself in a car accident, not deliberately. And when he went to hospital, he decided that he was on a placement and found that by orientating his body in different ways, it sped up his recovery. And he showed the x-rays of the speed of his recovery whilst in hospital. He exhibited this at Hayward as well. This placement used a grant from the National Coal Board and demonstrates Latham's interest in the observer position and the distant perspective. So for Latham, the distant observer was able to question from a critical distance ways of doings of an organization, and those immersed in those structures may not be able to see. So rather than just applying these ideas to the workplace, he felt that this view could be beneficial to the whole of humanity. So in 1975, Barbara negotiated a placement at the Scottish Development Agency, the Scottish Office, which is the precursor to the Scottish Government today. And the focus was to encourage industrial growth and employment. The focus was on two parts: urban renewal of the Upper and Lower Clyde and derelict land. In an early meeting, when speaking with the civil service, he was asked from which perspective he would be looking at Scotland. And he pointed at a map and said, this one. So he worked closely with the graphics department with aerial imagery. The feasibility study for the project outlined the various aspects of a marine complex that he was proposing in the Lower Clyde. One of his main concerns were the ecological issues, an attempt to make extractive industries such as energy and fishing sustainable. So because there was this new nuclear power station proposed for New Hunterston, he thought that the rise in temperature from the water outlets would allow for the sustaining of a sea fish farm, which he proposed. Another work that he proposed was a piece called, he made it. It was a piece called The Big Breather. And this was an acrylic cylinder of seawater with a bellows that inflated and deflated every 6 hours with the tide. This was proposed as a prototype for a new tidal power plant. He also took a great interest in an educational closed-circuit TV station in Glasgow. John argued strongly for it to remain in service, seeing the potential for future expanded community use of video. Other lines of inquiry were setting up a city farm within the Third Eye Centre in Glasgow. But the project he's best known for in Scotland became known as the Scottish Office Project, and this was a focus on the industrial waste sites called BINGs, in West Lothian. So these sites were massive mounds of shale from the 19th and early 20th century mining industry. The Scottish office wanted to resolve the issue of these derelict eyesores that would be so expensive to move, and John's solution was to leave them exactly as they were, with their value being apparent in time. So you can see on the left here this aerial image of this giant mountain, and John saw this as hundreds of years of rock being piled up to create a stacked up time base and a monument to its value of humanity. In this document, you can see he's declaring the Bings as works of art, and he saw this precedent of Duchamp as a strategic tool that could be used to retain these invaluable assets. So rather than him wanting to claim these as an artwork for himself, he saw in their retention a social value and yet an unknown future potential value. One of the Bings was the Five Sisters Bing, and this site he found really fascinating, but it also has an incredible backstory as well. These images were by Rita Donner, helped with Richard Hamilton. So a bit of history on this particular site. The Addiwell Works was the birth of the shale industry and the oil industry in Scotland. And they were directly related to the history of British imperialism. The Addiwell Works, next to the Five Sisters, was founded by James Young, and in 1964, his friend David Livingstone laid the foundation stone. Young funded many of Livingstone's African expeditions with funds from the oil industry, and he became the first European to visit the Victoria Falls in Zambia. Coincidentally, a couple decades later, John Latham's father, Geoffrey Latham, became a colonial administrator in northern Rhodesia, and Latham was born in the town of Livingstone, which sits next to the Victoria Falls. As a result of this, and the investigations into these kind of legacies and histories, we thought it appropriate, rather than inviting artists in to kind of examine these histories, to actually get a bursary to travel to Zambia and work with a partner organization. We're working with an organization called YY, based in Livingstone, and we're working with them to develop a kind of residency exchange program exploring art in Zambia now. So the second Bing site that John was investigating was the Green Dykes Bing, which he called the Nidri Woman. He anthropomorphized the site, named the different parts of the Bing after different parts of a body. It's absolutely enormous. It's 2 square miles. And I'll skip these a little bit. You can see here what he proposed was this very faint book monument on the top of the Bing. So in order for him to kind of, he wanted to make their artistic status explicit, so he proposed a series of book monuments for the site. So the book is not a sculpture itself, but an overtly artistic signifier for the public. It makes the importance of the site self-evident. For the Nidri sites, the books were made from shale from the site mixed with concrete, and they would contain a gallery and they'd serve as an observation platform. So the intention was not that this book would be the work itself, but would literally put the audience in the position of the observer above the landscape, into the observer position, allowing them to see the Bings as John had in the aerial imagery. Recognition for the Five Sisters Bing finally arrived in the early 90s, and since then West Lothian District Council have refused permission for use of the stone on the grounds that it's a work of art. In 2006, this demonstrates the value of this site to John. His ashes were scattered on the Nidri Heart site. So finally, moving to Flattime House. I'm grateful for your patience in this incredibly hot room. John lived in Bellenden Road from 1985 through till 2006 when he passed away. And for the last, you can see here that it was originally a very poor area. It was very cheap property, which is why he lived there. John and Barbara separated in '79, but they lived very closely together and so continued working together. And the site was he built this studio at the back. And you can see here what the building was like when John first moved there. Sorry, I lost a page. Yeah, so these are two images of the kitchen living area, and you can see that whilst John was living there, the space changed dramatically. And here are some images from the site recently. And so you can see, because the building was changing whilst John lived there, that gives us permission to change the space now. And it shouldn't be static. Likewise, the whole context in which the house is positioned has changed. The area now is very gentrified. And this is part of the reason why Flattime House came to existence in the first place. You can see some bollards on the left there. They're by Anthony Gormley, who also had a studio on the same street. And in the late 90s, this was part of a regeneration scheme for for inner city areas using culture. So one of the politicians who had worked in the Scottish office with John was called John McTurnan. He went on to advise Tony Blair, but he was working in Southwark and developed this program called the Belden Road Renewal Project, where they commissioned artists in the local area to do street improvements. And John was commissioned to make a giant book monument for Peckham Rye Common. This ended up getting watered down into a kind of vertical book structure going through the front of the building, and then watered down again into this structure as it remains today, which is a book going horizontally through a pane of glass in the front of the building. So we have this giant book at Flattime House. In the same process, John started to think of the whole house as an artwork. He named it Flattime House in 2003, and in the front gallery space, he put up a series of works for him to communicate these ideas, this cosmology of Flattime. So this display in the front gallery, he used to kind of communicate Flattime. Do you want to know what Flattime is? I'm worried because it's so hot. Okay, I'll give it a go. All right. So these are the works that John used to do this. This first piece, called Proto-Universe, has a glass plane and a white plane. This, on the left, represents nothing. On the right, it represents something. The piece is called Proto-Universe, so that's suggestive of a universe coming into existence. So you can kind of think of this as the moment of the Big Bang. The right, he called it the least event, and this is a duration called a Planck time, which is the shortest duration in which general relativity operates. So you can think of it as like the tiniest something emerging from nothing at all. You get this also in the logo that he designed for Flattime House with this 1-10, a movement from nothing of input to discharge. He ascribed to a cyclical model of the universe, which meant that the universe would expand and expand, reach a moment of maximum extent, and then collapse. And so nothing, or the glass plane, was representative of a shift, of a change, rather than, well, you can kind of think of it as a paradigm shift. The second piece in the room is something called Organism Somewhere, and you can think of this spray point as being the entirety of the universe or the smallest possible particle. And within that, you have this gesture, which is the entirety of human knowledge within that. The third piece, you have a piece called the Karamazov Triad. And from John's interpretation of Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, he used the three brothers to symbolize three different modes of being. Instinctive behavior with Mitya, rational thought with Ivan, and with Alyosha, reflective, intuitive thought. And these three different modes also correspond to different durations. So an instinctive being is acting on a day-to-day basis A rational being is projecting, say, 30 years ahead, and a reflective, intuitive being is operating on a much, much longer time base. You can kind of think of this as equivalent to the incidental person. With the time-based roller, he brings this all together. I think I'll skip it. But, but these modes of being are useful to kind of hold on to because they map onto how he anthropomorphized the house. So using the same strategy he did for the Nidri woman Bing, he named the different parts of a house after different parts of a body, and these correspond to different modes of being. So you have the body event, eating, sleeping, upstairs, the bedroom and bathroom, excreting and shelter. Then you have the brain, the office, where rational thought was to take place. The hand was the studio, the space for intuitive production of ideas. And the mind, this gallery where he showed these works, was space for reflection upon these intuitive ideas. So at the front, you have this book sculpture, which again he's using as a kind of overt artistic strategy that something is happening here. The pages of the book are interleaved, so you can't approach it in a rational manner. You need to approach it intuitively, and it transitions through this pane of glass, which is representative of a paradigm shift. So you're going from wider society into this room, the mind, which is the space for reflection. And this space of reflection is dependent upon the studio, which is the space for intuitive production of ideas. And you can't be a purely reflective, intuitive being because you need to have done your tax returns and things like this. You need to have been a rational being. So John would say that this was projecting ahead about 30 years. And you can't just be a rational being because you need to have eaten your dinner and had shelter, and you need to depend on instinctive behavior as well. Spray painted between these different states are the shift on the wall to represent this different shifts of state. So that kind of dictates to us how we should operate the house, what he called a living sculpture. It means that today it needs to remain a domestic space. So if you come to Flat Time House, you might see that the dishes have been done, not been done by the artist, that the laundry's on, it's a functioning space. And this all determines the type of activity that takes place in the house, which often uses like these instinctive kind of structures. It's also a rational space, so research is undertaken with the archive. We support a lot of work in this area. And also the administration is directly visible. So if you come to the house, you'll see our office and my really messy desk there. The first archivist of Flat Time House was the artist Laure Provost, who was John Latham's assistant for 5 years. You can see her there on the right. And this also kind of represents, I suppose, with Laure, she became the first resident artist at Flat Time House as well. The first exhibition that wasn't of work by John Latham. And she did this exhibition where she hid fish fingers around the house, and you had to kind of, well, I wasn't involved, but you had to cook fish fingers every day and hide them for her. So in terms of our current residency program, these different strands affect the type of activity that take place. So with Rory Pilgrim, he worked with the legacy of the Artist Placement Group over his 1-year residency that he had with us. Agata Medeska was interested in parallels between John's ideas of flux and change, relating that to post-Soviet Poland. And with artists like Mark Shamovitz, it allowed a space for experimentation for a much more experienced artist. Artists like Lena Hermsdorf have engaged closely with John's ideas, and she split the rooms of the house using these enormous panes of glass, with Grace DeRitu also working with these legacies and histories of Artist Placement Group. We've worked also with a local organization called Into Art for the last 10 years, who work with artists with learning disabilities and with autism. And with them, they see the connection being between John's approach to intuitive thought and the practice of the artists. With Eloise Horser, we worked more around the Nation of Time, and you can see in the house, for each of these exhibitions, the house completely shifts and changes to accompany the artist, to kind of focus on what they need from the space. We also commissioned with her an archival project for a retrospective of Barbara Savini at Modern Art Oxford, where she catalogued and archived Barbara's archive of newspapers. Sorry, it's just so hot here. Yeah, I'm gonna wind up, I think. So, yeah, I'm going to skip this activity. I'll just finish on a few thoughts. So, to remain living as a space, Flat Time House requires that the mind, brain, hand, and organs are all active. It can't look like a house, it has to be a house, and it needs to be active instinctively, rationally, and intuitively. As a living sculpture or organism as artwork, it is inherent in the material of the building, but in the metaphorical manifestation of the activity of a human. It's not a museum of John Latham, but a flat time of his ideas and cosmology. It's our responsibility to question these ideas and question how these ideas might be situated in society now. Thanks so much.